If you live long enough, you get to meet some really interesting people along the way. My mother lives in North Augusta, South Carolina, which is right across the river from Augusta, Georgia. So we grew up in that area. Actually, we grew up in another community very close by. It means nothing to you. It's called Beech Island. Don't get excited. It's spelled Beech, Beech Island. There was no beach anywhere around. Another very famous person, well, another, as if I'm famous, another person lived in Beech Island who was famous, a guy by the name of James Brown. Anybody remember James Brown? But just James Brown, you know what I'm talking about. My apologies to the lady right back there who jumped. You remember James Brown. I feel good. Papa's got a brand new bag, those kinds of things. Well, my brothers own a paving company, and Mr. Brown did some business with them when I was working for my brothers back a while ago, many years ago now, 25 more years ago. And so they sent me to deal with Mr. Brown. I'll skip all the details as to why. But interestingly, when you drove down a half-mile driveway to Mr. Brown's house, and I won't describe all the things there because it would sound like I'm being petty, but among other things, there were several brand new cars sitting there, all of which still had the stickers in the windows from when they were purchased. I noticed that one of them had a Bible in the back, up in the back deck. And so I asked Mr. Brown, I said, you have a Bible back there? Now, I can actually emulate his voice, but I won't do so because it would sound like I'm being mean. But Mr. Brown told me that he read the Bible. I almost said reads. He's dead. He said, I read the Bible every day. I said, that's fascinating. What method of Bible study do you use? He said, I just let it fall open. Where it falls open, that's where I read. I said, well, what if it fell open to the same place every day? He didn't appreciate that question. Now, his particular methodology of Bible study is still better than most, because most people don't do anything. Now, I don't know if Mr. Brown was telling the truth when he said he read his Bible every day. Other interactions with Mr. Brown made me doubt that was the case. But if he read the Bible every day, if he did, then that made him unique, because most people don't. And most of us, when we read our Bibles, don't do a very good job at it. I remember many years ago, back in the 1970s, an older lady in our congregation telling me that she was following the plan to read the entire Bible in a year, and that if she got into bed and realized she had not read the section for that day, she jumped up and read it hurriedly and went back to bed so she wouldn't feel guilty. And I asked her, oh, interestingly, what passage did you read last night? She had no memory. What was it about? I don't know. But you got it in. Yes, I did. Well, I still think that's a pretty bad method of Bible study, don't you? And so if people start looking at their Bibles and say, well, if I really wanted to know the Bible, in the sense that I'm looking to understand God, I want to know what God thinks, what God feels, at least as much as we mortals can, what method will we use? I think that if you just start reading the Bible through, you may miss it. I used to teach Old Testament history down in Montgomery many years ago, and I would teach my students about the Old Testament. It's not there in our Bibles in chronological order. The way it's been organized by people, it's not chronological. Therefore, if you start reading in Genesis, by the way, it does start there. But if you start reading in Genesis and read through the Old Testament, things are not going to make sense to you sometime, because this happens before that, and that happens before that, the way it's put together. And so understand that it's been put together by the type of books like history and poetry and law. And rather than reading them categorized like that, try to understand how it is chronologically. As a matter of fact, my final exam for my students, most of whom were freshmen, was to outline in detail the entire Old Testament chronologically. Therefore, the next semester, I was teaching the book of Acts. The parents complained about how much the kids had to learn, and they were just freshmen. Okay, so they put me in one book instead of those. But if you really want to understand the Bible, that's what you would do. And then if you read it as a book of laws, you're still going to miss the point. Now, there are laws in the Bible, there's no doubt about that, but it's not a book of laws. Maybe I can illustrate it better by saying it this way. Last weekend, as Terry pointed out, we had a lot of couples in here who came to our workshop for marriages in crisis. Some of those couples came to church with us last week. And as we teach these couples how to understand how they got to where they are, and how they can understand how to heal their relationships if they so choose, one of the principles that we teach them is, if you really want to understand another person, if you really want to know them and understand them, then you must hear their stories. Because everybody has stories. I used to believe many years ago that we are some of our experiences. I've discovered that that's not the case. In life, we are not the sum of our experiences. We are the sum of our interpretation of our experiences, which means you can have two kids grow up in the very same house where all kinds of bad things are going on, and one turns out one way and one turns out the other because they perceive differently what occurred there. So not only should I hear the other person's stories, but if at all possible, understand how he or she felt about that story, how he or she reacted to that story. And so we teach couples what you need to do is start talking about your stories. Interestingly, there's a lot of research, not my research done by John Gottman at the University of Washington's Love Lab, research that shows that the more you know about the stories of another person, the easier it is to love them, and the longer lasting that the love will be. And so they have a thing called a love map. And that's where you actually go back and you say, let me tell you stories from my childhood, and you share. Let me tell you stories from my adolescence, and you share. And you go through your life like that. And the more you understand the stories of another person, the more you understand who he or she is. You begin to understand why they do what they do, how they feel what they feel, all those kinds of things that help us know another person. Now, if we really wanted to know God, as much as a human can, you understand that God actually is transcendent. I can know him only to a level. Then I need to know his stories. And primarily, that's what the Bible is. There are laws within it, there's no doubt, but primarily the Bible is a book of stories. And even the laws, not all of which, but most of them, or at least a great number of them, have stories that explain the law so we can understand it. Now, Judge Holt could probably explain that could definitely explain that a whole lot better than I. But even in our country, if a law is passed, it gets tested in court. And then this story of this person on this side, and this story of that person on that side, and then a judge, or sometimes a group of judges will make a decision about this is how that should be interpreted, and it becomes case law. And so we actually understand laws in terms of the stories and how they're applied to the stories of life. Now, I oversimplified that and probably just butchered it in explaining it. Judge Holt is probably back there going, he should stick to preaching and leave law alone. But it's the same principle, you understand. Now, therefore, for the rest of the summer, Lord willing, we're going to be looking at stories. Stories in the Old Testament, because there's some great stories there, and not only because there are great stories in the Old Testament, but because of the fact that we sometimes think ourselves so familiar with the stories of the New Testament that they have somehow lost their power. At least it appears that way to me. Not only that, there's stories in the Old Testament that we probably have never heard. Seriously, they're there. And if we have heard them, it may have been so long ago that we really don't understand their power anymore. So we're going to try to understand God by looking at the stories. Now, I won't be preaching every Sunday this summer. I already have a couple of guest speakers lined up that you're going to love. Awesome men in whom I have tremendous confidence. But primarily, at least when I'm preaching, we're going to look at the stories. And so if you will, turn your Bible, if you have one with you, to 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. It's a story. Now, you may have some familiarity with the story. You may have heard it preached somewhere along the line. But here's the way to do it. I was listening to some preacher on the radio in the last year. I don't know exactly who he was or when it was. I lose track of time now. And as I was listening to him, he said, have you ever wondered why that God didn't wait until film was invented, television, movies, cameras, those kinds of things? Have you ever wondered why God didn't wait till then to bring Jesus? I mean, if Jesus had not come to the earth in the first century, but came to the earth in this day and time, he'd be covered by all the news media. CBS, NBC, Fox, everybody would be there all over the world. He said, have you ever wondered why he would bring Jesus at the time that he did, rather than waiting to a time like now when he could be all over the internet? Now, nobody can answer that question for sure, but I thought that his opinion was very interesting. He said, because when you read a story, you can actually see more of it than if you watch it on a screen. Because as your mind begins to picture all the things that go with it, you actually have a bigger and broader picture of it. I think that makes sense. Now, there's pros and cons to that. One of the cons, for example, is we tend to adapt the stories to our culture. Those paintings up there, for example, allegedly of Jesus, are of a very handsome European with blue eyes. Jesus was a Jew. He didn't look like that. He didn't have long hair. But as a matter of fact, he was not handsome. Isaiah predicted there would be no beauty about him that we should desire him. He was not a handsome man. Now, I read that and go, way to go, God. You helped out all the rest of us. He doesn't have to be some charismatic, good-looking guy. He's just an everyday, ordinary guy that didn't have any particular beauty about him. He would not have had long hair because he had not taken that particular vow, and the only Jews that had long hair were the ones with the Nazarite vow, et cetera, et cetera. So he didn't look like that. So some of the downside is that we tend to see it so much into our culture that we may sometimes miss the real picture. The advantage of that, though, is by seeing it in terms of our culture, we may be able to understand it in ways that we couldn't if we were just watching the video. Because I can make the applications into my culture as to how it applies to me today. So I see the pros and cons. I mean, whether you agree or not, you see my point, that there are pros and cons to it being in the written word, because now we can play out in our mind. Now here's the story. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now, the Syrians, on one of their raids, had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his Lord, "Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel." And the king of Syria said, "Go now, and I'll send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver. By the way, that's about 750 pounds. 6,000 shekels of gold, that's about 150 pounds, and 10 changes of clothes. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man sends words to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. Back to verse 1, please, gentlemen. Now, that's not all the story. The story goes to the entire 5th chapter. And what I hope to do is to start it today and complete it next Sunday, Lord willing. But look at the beginning. Naaman, that's his name. Easy enough to understand. Commander of the army of the king of Syria. By the way, in your Bible, it may say Aram, A-R-A-M, rather than Syria, because that's what was used in the translations for centuries. Aram, by the way, is an area in the middle of modern-day Syria. Therefore, the newer translations will say Syria because that's where it is now. Now, I don't know if you remember your map of the Holy Land or not, but if that's the Mediterranean over here, here's Israel just to this side, just to the east of Israel. Actually, this is Greece. But just to the east of Israel, y'all didn't get it on that side because you didn't see what I pointed to. I said, this is Greece. Anyway, what was I talking about? All right, so here's the Mediterranean over here. Here's Israel. Just to this side of Israel is Jordan, and up here is Syria. Aram is an area in the middle of Syria. He was a great man with his master and in high favor. Catch this next part. Because by him, the Lord had given victory to Syria. There's our first thing to stop and ask, what are we learning in this story? Now, they were Syrians, Aramites, if you will, but they were Syrians. And we look at this and go, but wait a minute. This guy was a good soldier, and he had many victories because the Lord had given him victory? Wait a minute. I mean, God was the God of his Israelis. God was the God of Israel. How can we read in the Holy Book that God was actually giving victory to a nation that would be considered, on many occasions at least, an enemy to Israel? If you read the Old Testament carefully, you'll find that sometimes our theology really gets messed up in there. What I mean by that is this. We tend to reach conclusions, and once we have reached those conclusions, we tend to make everything else fit into it. Like, if this is what I believe, and I read something in the Bible that doesn't seem to coincide with what I believe, what most people will do is twist this to make it fit what I believe. Now, why would God bless Syria? It has always been, and I think it still is now, that God chooses the people that are his, and God chooses the people that he will bless, even when we don't understand it. I won't go into the story, but there's another story in the Old Testament where there's a guy by the name of Balaam. Balaam was a prophet of God. And the kings came to Balaam and wanted Balaam to crush the Israelis, the Jews, the people of God. And Balaam, the scripture says he was a prophet of God, didn't know who they were. Now, how does that fit into our theology? Because by that time you understand that they were the children of Abraham, and they were practicing circumcision, and God had given them laws, such as that the male should be circumcised on the 8th day. And if a person wasn't circumcised, he would not be of God, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And with all of that, and there being the nation of God, the nation of Israel, God's people, and all of that, you still occasionally read in the Old Testament about other people that God blessed. Oh, and Balaam was even a prophet. You say, well, what does that tell you? It tells me that God does not live in the box I have made for him. That I need to understand that God is God. God is sovereign. God does what he wishes to do. Oh, it also means that I should be extremely careful about being judgmental toward people that I don't think fit inside my box. Do you think there are some people in Christendom, because Christendom has pretty well split itself up. Would you agree or disagree about that? I mean, there's a whole bunch of us within Christendom. I mean, if I had a .22 rifle, how many churches could I hit shooting from here? Don't report me. It was just an illustration. I'm not about to shoot anybody. I don't even have a .22 rifle. I'm sure Chris could sell me one, but I don't have one right now. You understand that Christendom has just kind of divided itself up, and sometimes people then say, well, those aren't the people of God because they're not of us. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, I was taught that we were the only Christians. Anybody else taught that? And that everybody else, no matter how much they claimed to love Jesus, were all going to hell because they weren't part of our church. Anybody else taught like that when you were a kid? I'm about to tell another story. I've told it here before, but it's in the Constitution that once you pass 60, you can tell the same story over and over. And if it's not in the Constitution, it should be. So forgive me for redundant if you remember this story. Many years ago, I was invited to come speak for a church, and some of the people there took umbrage that the church had invited me because I didn't fit into their mold of what they understood a Christian to be. And so a protest began to take place within that church. Don't let Joe come here. One of the church elders called me, and I said, well, that's easy enough to remedy. I won't come. I don't want to cause any harm. I would not in any wish to cause any harm. No, we're taking a stand. You have to come. Oh, I didn't want to be in the middle of that. So I got there on Saturday afternoon. They put me into my hotel, and Sunday morning, after the Sunday morning service, he said, by the way, one of those guys wants to meet with you this afternoon, and so we've arranged a meeting with you and the guy who wants to question whether you're a Christian or not. I wasn't excited about that meeting. So I'm sitting there with those church elders. This guy walks in, he looks me in the eye, and he says, I have one question. What? Are Baptists going to hell? I said, now that's kind of intriguing. Why Baptist? Why not Methodist, Episcopalians? I mean, why Baptist? He said, because my brother's a Baptist. And I told my brother he's going to hell because he's a Baptist. Actually, I phrased it wrong. He said, are Baptists going to heaven? And I said that. He said, so I want to know, will I see my brother in heaven? And I said, I'm pretty sure you won't see your brother in heaven. Don't have to worry about that one bit. He walked out of the room and he was very happy with the answer. One of those church elders looked at me and said, I don't think he heard what you just said. It's so easy to say these people are right because they think like I think. I don't think you can find any two people on the planet who agree on everything. And to say this person is of God because he meets my criteria is invalid. God chooses those who are his. And I'm not going to be offended one iota when I get to heaven to see people there that I thought would not be, or that at least at one point in my life I thought I would not be. What about you? This Syrian was blessed by God. I can't explain it theologically. I'm just saying that's one thing you learn about God in this Old Testament story. The one thing you learn about God, or one of the things you learn about God in this Old Testament story, is he chooses his people, not me. Now, the next thing, he was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. This is interesting because if he had been a Jewish leper, he could not have been a mighty man of valor. If he'd been a Jewish leper, he would have had to live separate from the people. He could be around other people who were lepers, but he couldn't be around anybody else. Yet in the Syrian society, which is not governed by the Old Testament laws God gave the Jews, then he can associate with them. By the way, we look at that leprosy law in the Old Testament as being a hygienic law. What that means is this. Leprosy was not a disease. Leprosy was a generic word that covered all kinds of skin diseases. Therefore, as part of the hygienic law, meaning we want to make sure that we don't have our whole nation get sick, or a great portion of our nation get sick. Anytime somebody had some kind of a skin disease, they were alienated from the people until such time as they got well of that skin disease so that they would not be contagious. Well, he's not alienated. He's not separated because he's not a Jew. His soldiers follow him. Not only that, but he's married and apparently doing well. Look at the next verse. The next verse says, now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel. Not only then was he a Syrian, he was a Syrian who fought the Israelis. And it said that God gave him many victories. That's a deep question. I'd love to look at that sometime when we have time. And she worked in service of Naaman's wife. By the way, that's what they did back in those days. In those days, when you went in and you fought against other people, when you whipped them, you took their animals and you took their people. And their people became your slaves. So she's a slave. You follow? Because she was stolen out of the country of Israel. Now, the next verse says, she said to her mistress, that's Naaman's wife. This is the woman that she works for, the woman who owns her. She said to her mistress, would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. By the way, that prophet's name is Elisha. Elisha is a very powerful prophet. Elisha succeeded Elijah. You may remember, if you remember Old Testament stories, that Elijah, God decided to take. And God sent down this fiery chariot. Anybody remember that Old Testament story? And Elijah got into the fiery chariot and rode back off into the sky. I think that would be the coolest way to go. I mean, just think, if you're going to have to go to heaven, why not deluxe service? Here comes the chariot, you get on. Oh, and there's some old gospel songs about that. Remember, swing down chariot, come and let me ride. All that great music about that. Elisha saw that. And before Elijah left, he said, I want more blessing than he had. And God decided to bless Elisha more. He was an extremely powerful prophet. He was also somewhat cranky. I think that's biblical evidence that you can be the prophet and be cranky, and God's okay with that. I may be stretching it a tad, but I like to think that. I'll tell you how cranky he was not too long after that. By the way, Elisha was bald. I'm all for bald men. God bless you. Elisha was bald, and some children came along making fun of him on one occasion, saying, go up too, Baldy. Because he'd been telling a story about how Elijah was taken to the chariot. Go up too, Baldy. And Elisha, the cranky prophet, turned and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord, and 2 bears came out and killed 42 children. There's got to be some biblical principle in there that we could use today, but I'm not sure quite what it is. So here is this cranky prophet. He said, would that my Lord were with a prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. By the way, this little girl carried some credibility. It doesn't say why. We don't know why they would believe her. Maybe she had such integrity. Maybe she was such a great worker. Maybe they noticed that in everything she was honest. Maybe that somehow she was exposed to her mistress's jewelry but never took anything. I don't know why, but for some reason this girl was very credible. So the next verse says, so Naaman went in and told his lord, that would be the king of Syria, the king of Aram. Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. Thus and so is what the writer put there so he wouldn't have to explain all this in great detail. So what happens next then is this. The king of Syria said, go now and I'll send a letter to the king of Israel. So he went, taking with him 750 pounds of silver. I don't know what that was worth then, but it's worth a whole lot now. 150 pounds of gold. Can you imagine the fortune involved in this? And 10 changes of clothes. So Naaman had obviously won a lot of victories and collected a lot of things from the people that he had defeated. He was a very wealthy man. The next verse. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. Look how the king reacted. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God? To kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he's seeking a quarrel with me. By the way, I don't really blame him. He knew that there was nothing he could do to cure this man. Here's what he's thinking. This guy, the king of Syria, the king of Aram, is looking for an excuse to wage war against us. Now, we've already read that this little girl doesn't necessarily mean she was a child, you understand? But we've already read that this girl had been stolen in a raid against Israel. So there's some animosity between these two countries already. There's some raids taking place back and forth. And now the king is saying, he's looking for an excuse for a full-fledged war. And his excuse is, he has sent me this leper. By the way, can you imagine the diplomatic difficulty to receive the leper? I mean, under Jewish law, this man has to be alienated, separated. He can't be even close to anybody else. But he is a representative of the king of Syria. Can you see already the predicament the king is in? Because now he's got to let this leper in to actually talk to him, when by their law, he should not be even close to the palace, much less inside of it. So there's a difficulty here. You see this difficulty? He decides that the better course of action would be apparently to see the leper, and now he reads the letter and goes, I can't heal this man. By the way, do you think people in this day and time do things like that to pick fights, to start wars? Do you think that ever happens in this day and time? I'm going to be very careful with this story. I'm not going to name any names whatsoever because it could be sensitive to some people. Several years ago, a dear friend of mine, who will be, by the way, on the summer celebration at Lipscomb this week, a very dear friend of mine was living in one state. He was the minister for a certain church in that state, which was doing extremely well. I was actually changing planes in the airport in Atlanta when I heard over the PA system that I had a phone call. And that'll make you worry. When you're going through the terminal, headed to another plane, and you hear Joe Beam, please pick up the courtesy phone, and you think somebody's dead. So I went and got the courtesy phone. They gave me the name of my friend and told me to call him back. I called him back. I'm in great consternation. What's the matter? He said, I got to make a decision today. I want your opinion. What? Well, there's this church in this other city that has invited me to come be their minister. And I know that church, on occasion, has had lots of terrible things to say about you in the past. So I wanted your opinion as to whether I should go there or not. Now, you think that'd be an easy answer, don't you? Like any church that would say bad things about me is a bad church. You don't need to go to a bad church. But I knew that church had been changing over the years. Lots of things had occurred there. So I said, in my opinion, you should go. By the way, he's told many audiences since then that of all his friends he asked, apparently I was the last one, but of all the friends he asked, everybody said, don't go. I was the only one who said, I think you should go. So he went. They began to do good things, and then he called me one day. He said, it's your fault I'm here. No, brother, you made that decision. I just gave you my wisdom, which is worth exactly what you paid for it. He said, well, there's one guy giving me a lot of trouble, and he called the guy's name. I knew the guy extremely well. I had gone to college with a guy back in the late 1800s. I knew him. He said he just called and said he wants to come ask me a few questions. He's on his way over. I just want your advice as to how to answer, how to deal with his questions. And I said, well, you know he's coming to start a war. There is no doubt about it. That's who he is. That's how he operates. And the questions he asks you will be designed to start that war. So I think you have two choices. You can either hedge and try to avoid the war, or just go ahead and tell him what you believe and get the war over with, because it's coming one way or the other. And so that's what he did. Twice now he's listened to me. Twice now he's called me back and said, this is your fault. The brother who came to ask him the questions had a tape recorder hidden in his coat pocket. Hidden. Recorded the entire conversation, which is fine. My friend didn't say anything untoward, but just the fact that you would hide it. Do you understand the mindset behind this? And then the brother wrote a letter to that church and to every other church of Christ in driving distance, saying, let me tell you about the heresies of brother, and named my minister friend. This heresy, this heresy, this heresy, this heresy. Designed it where it would be delivered on Friday afternoon. My friend called me back again. That was the second time, and he said, this is your fault. He said, Sunday morning they're dismissing Bible classes for me to answer these charges. What do you think I should say? You know, you're a glutton for punishment. You keep asking me and everything I tell you makes it worse. Here's what I would do. I told him, and he did. He got up Sunday morning and he said, let me answer the questions. He did. Boom, 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 boom. Then he said, the other church didn't want me to leave. I can actually be preaching there again tonight. I resign. And he sat down. The church elders jumped up and said, you can't quit. We're with you. We back you. The church split. It was a war. And within 2 years, had tripled in size. Why had it tripled? Obviously, God was blessing them. Do you see this? He couldn't avoid the war, so he decided to fight it as a holy war. I will do what I believe is right. I hope that nobody leaves. I hope that no bad thing happens, but I will stand up for what I believe. I will not hide. I'm not going to be mean. I'm going to be as loving and kind, as generous as I can. But you can't hide forever when somebody else wants to fight. Now, can you? By the way, after the church tripled, my minister friend's wife happened to be in the mall and saw the guy who had done all that, the guy who had the recorder in his pocket. She walked over to him in the mall and said, I just need to thank you. He said, what? She said, this church could have never grown like that had it not been for you. And I just want to thank you for letting God use you to get our church in a place where we could really grow. He looked at her and said, you're being facetious. She said, no, I am dead serious. Thank you. And then she walked away. This king was worried. If you live in fear of the war, how can God bless you with a victory? Now, I don't mean we go looking for a fight. Never. That's just wrong. But when you know that